The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by the weekly mail coach that kicked up dust clouds visible for miles across the Wyoming plains. Caleb Rawlins stood on the porch of his weather-beaten cabin, squinting against the harsh September sun as he turned the envelope over in his calloused hands. The return address bore the seal of the matrimonial news agency out of San Francisco, a service he'd written to 3 months prior, not out of any burning desire for companionship, but because he'd made a promise to a dying woman. His mother had passed in the spring, her final days spent fretting over her only son's solitary existence. "A man needs a woman's touch in his home, Caleb," she'd whispered, her paper-thin hand clutching his. "Promise me you'll try." And because he could deny her nothing, not even in her final hours, he'd promised now. As he broke the seal and unfolded the crisp paper, he felt the weight of that promise settling on his shoulders like a yoke. The agency's representative wrote in flowery script that they had found a suitable match, a Miss Eleanor Whitlock of St. Louis, age 26, experienced in household management, willing to relocate to the territories. She would arrive in Mercy's Bend on the 15th of the month, weather permitting. Caleb folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. 3 days. He had 3 days to prepare for a stranger who would share his home, his meals, perhaps eventually his bed. The thought made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. It had been 4 years since Martha died in that blizzard. 4 years of sleeping alone, eating alone, existing in the profound silence of grief. He spent those 3 days in a frenzy of preparation that would have amused his ranch hands if he'd had any. But Caleb worked his modest spread alone, running a small herd of cattle and breaking horses for the army fort 50 miles north. He scrubbed the cabin floor until the pine boards gleamed, beat the dust from the single rug his mother had braided, and even attempted to patch the gaps in the chinking where the wind whistled through on cold nights. On the morning of the 15th, he hitched his 2 best horses to the wagon and made the half-day journey to town. Mercy's Bend wasn't much to look at. A single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a boarding house that doubled as a restaurant, and a tiny church that shared its pastor with 3 other towns. But it had a stagecoach stop, and that was all that mattered today. The coach was late, as usual. Caleb waited outside Murphy's general store, his hat pulled low against the afternoon glare. Sam Murphy emerged periodically to offer commentary on the weather, the price of beef, and the foolishness of men who ordered wives through the mail like they were purchasing a plow from a catalog. "No offense meant, Rawlins," Murphy added hastily, mopping his brow with a checkered handkerchief. "Just seems to me a man ought to know what he's getting before he makes such a commitment." Caleb didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that silence was often the best answer to Sam Murphy's observations. The coach finally appeared as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. A cloud of dust, and the driver's cursing announcing its arrival long before it rattled to a stop in front of the boarding house. Caleb straightened, his palms suddenly damp despite the dry heat. The driver climbed down and began unloading baggage while passengers emerged, stiff and dusty from the journey. An elderly couple, a traveling salesman, 2 soldiers heading to the fort, and then her. She was smaller than he'd expected, though he realized he hadn't known what to expect. She wore a travel-stained dress of brown wool, practical and unadorned. A simple bonnet framed a face that might have been called pretty if not for the startling absence of expression. Her features were as still as marble, her gray eyes fixed on some middle distance as if she were looking through the world rather than at it. The driver helped her down, said something that might have been a pleasantry. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge he'd spoken. She simply stood beside her single traveling trunk, hands folded, waiting. Caleb approached slowly, acutely aware of his own rough appearance, the dust on his clothes, the sweat staining his hatband. "Miss Whitlock." Those gray eyes shifted to him, but she didn't speak, didn't nod, simply looked. "I'm Caleb Rawlins," he continued, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. "I've come to, that is, I'm here to take you home, to the ranch." Still nothing, not a word, not a gesture. The other passengers were stealing curious glances now, and Sam Murphy had emerged from his store to gawk openly. Do you understand me, ma'am?" The slightest flicker in those gray eyes. Perhaps annoyance, perhaps acknowledgement, but her lips remained sealed. The driver, finished with the luggage, approached with a knowing look. "She ain't spoke a word since she boarded in Cheyenne," he said, not unkindly. "Paid her fare, showed her ticket, but not a peep. Thought she might be foreign, but she seemed to understand well enough when we called out the stops." Caleb felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. Dear God, what had he done? His mother's voice echoed in his memory. A woman's touch. Caleb. But this silent specter seemed more likely to haunt his home than warm it. He hefted her trunk into the wagon bed, then turned to offer his hand to help her up. She looked at his extended palm for a long moment before placing her own gloved hand in his, allowing him to assist her onto the bench seat. The contact was brief, impersonal, but he noticed how her fingers trembled slightly before she withdrew them. The ride back to the ranch stretched before them like an eternity. Caleb had never been much for conversation, but the complete absence of it pressed against him like a physical thing. He tried. Lord knew he tried. "The ranch isn't much," he began, guiding the horses onto the rutted track that led north out of town. "Just a cabin and a barn, some corrals. I run about 50 head of cattle, break horses when I can catch them." Silence. "Weather's been dry this year. Could use some rain for the grazing, but it makes for easier traveling." Nothing. "That's Devil's Tower off to the east there. The Indians, the Lakota, they call it Bear Lodge. Sacred to them." She might have been carved from stone for all the response she gave. She sat rigid on the seat beside him, eyes fixed straight ahead, hands folded in her lap. Only the subtle rise and fall of her breath beneath the brown wool indicated she was alive at all. As the hours passed and the landscape shifted from scrub plains to rolling hills dotted with pine, Caleb's attempts at conversation dwindled to observations about landmarks, then to comments about the horses, and finally to silence. But it was a different silence than he was used to, not the comfortable quiet of solitude, but something tense and watchful. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if he'd had the heart to appreciate them. The cabin looked even smaller and shabbier than he remembered, squatting in the shadow of a rocky ridge like something that had grown there rather than been built. He helped her down from the wagon, again noting that slight tremor in her touch. "This is it," he said unnecessarily. "Home." She stood looking at the cabin, and for the first time, he saw something shift in her expression, so subtle he might have imagined it. Her eyes moved from the cabin to the barn, to the empty corrals, to the vast expanse of land stretching away in every direction. Then she walked to the cabin door and waited. Caleb hurried to open it for her, suddenly embarrassed by the sparse interior. One room served as kitchen and living space, with a cast-iron stove, a rough table, 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding his meager collection of dishes and supplies. A doorway led to the single bedroom with its narrow bed and washstand. "You can have the bedroom," he said quickly. "I'll bed down out here by the stove. It's warmer anyway. Come winter." She moved into the cabin like a ghost, her eyes taking in every detail but her face revealing nothing. She touched nothing, said nothing, just stood in the middle of the room like she was waiting for something. Caleb brought in her trunk, then busied himself with building up the fire in the stove. "You must be hungry after the journey. I've got some beans and salt pork, a bit of cornbread from yesterday." He puttered about, heating the simple meal, all the while acutely aware of her silent presence. When he set a plate before her at the table, she sat and ate mechanically, each movement precise and contained. He tried once more to engage her, talking about the work that needed doing, the nearest neighbors 5 miles west, the town's monthly social gatherings. He might as well have been talking to the walls. As the evening deepened and the coyotes began their nightly chorus in the hills, Caleb made up a pallet for himself near the stove. He gestured toward the bedroom. "There's fresh water in the pitcher. Privy's out back, if you need anything." She rose from the table, crossed to the bedroom, and closed the door behind her with a soft click. Caleb sat for a long time staring at that closed door, wondering what in God's name he'd brought into his life. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and finding every gap in the walls. He thought he heard something, a sound from the bedroom, perhaps a stifled sob, but when he listened harder, there was only the wind and the settling of old wood. He bedded down on his makeshift pallet, pulling a worn blanket up to his chin. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, it brought dreams of Martha's voice calling to him through the snow, words he could never quite make out before the white silence swallowed them whole. In the morning, he woke to find Eleanor already up, standing at the window, looking out at the vastness of Wyoming. Her face was as composed as marble, but her hands, he noticed, were clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles had gone white. The days that followed settled into a strange routine, marked more by what wasn't said than what was. Caleb would rise before dawn, as was his habit, to find Eleanor already awake, sitting at the table with her hands folded, waiting. He'd nod a greeting that went unacknowledged, then set about making coffee and preparing a simple breakfast, biscuits when he had flour, cornmeal mush when he didn't, always with salt pork or the occasional egg from the handful of chickens that scratched around the yard. She ate what he put before her, drank the bitter coffee without complaint or comment, then rose to clear the dishes while he headed out to tend the stock. When he returned at midday, he'd find the cabin transformed, floors swept, surfaces wiped clean, his few possessions arranged with a precision that somehow made the sparse room feel even emptier. She worked continuously, but silently, like a clockwork figure wound too tight. The silence began to wear on him in unexpected ways. Caleb had thought himself a man comfortable with quiet, had even prided himself on it. But this was different. His own silence had been a choice. Hers felt like a wall, impenetrable and absolute. He found himself talking more than he had in years, filling the void with observations about the weather, the cattle, anything to push back against the oppressive quiet. Found a calf tangled in the brush down by Miller's Creek. He'd say over supper, "Mother was half crazy with worry. Took me near an hour to work him free." Nothing. Spotted wolf tracks out by the north pasture. Might have to ride out there tonight. Make sure they don't get too interested in the stock. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. By the end of the first week, the neighbors had begun to talk. Caleb heard the whispers when he rode into town for supplies. The mysterious mail-order bride who wouldn't speak, who some said was cursed. Others claimed was simple-minded. Martha's cousin, Agnes Fletcher, cornered him outside the general store with barely concealed glee. "Is it true she hasn't spoken a single word?" Agnes asked, her eyes bright with the prospect of scandal. "Mary Patterson said she saw her at your wagon, standing there like a statue. Some are saying she's been struck dumb by the Lord for some terrible sin." "She's just quiet," Caleb said curtly, loading sacks of flour onto his wagon. "Quiet?" Agnes laughed, a sharp sound like breaking glass. "There's quiet, and then there's unnatural. You should have the pastor come out. Caleb, maybe he could—" "Good day, Mrs. Fletcher." He climbed onto the wagon seat and drove away, leaving her sputtering in the street, but her words gnawed at him during the ride home. Was something wrong with Eleanor? She seemed to understand everything he said, responded appropriately to situations even without words. Just that morning, when he'd mentioned the approaching storm clouds, she'd brought in the washing without being asked. She wasn't simple. He could see intelligence in those gray eyes, along with something else he couldn't quite name. The dust storm hit 2 days later, rolling across the plains like a brown wall of fury. Caleb had seen it coming, had hurried to secure the livestock and cover the well. He burst through the cabin door just as the first wind struck, slamming it shut against the onslaught. Eleanor stood at the window, watching the approaching storm with the first real emotion he'd seen on her face. Not fear exactly, but a kind of recognition. As the dust began to seep through every crack and crevice, she moved with swift efficiency, wetting cloths to place at the windowsills, covering the food stores, all without a word of direction from him. They worked together in the dim light, the storm howling outside like a living thing. At one point, a particularly vicious gust shook the entire cabin, and Eleanor stumbled. Nearly dropping the water basin she carried, Caleb reached out instinctively to steady her, his hands closing on her shoulders. She froze at his touch, her whole body going rigid. In the lamplight, he saw her face clearly, the flash of panic in her eyes, the way her breath came quick and shallow. He released her immediately, stepping back with his hands raised. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to help." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she nodded. It was the first deliberate communication she'd offered since her arrival, and something in Caleb's chest loosened a fraction. The storm raged through the night, and they sat it out together at the table, the lamp between them creating a small circle of light in the darkness. Caleb found himself talking again, but differently this time, not to fill the silence, but to share it. "Martha hated storms like this," he said quietly. "Said the dust got into everything, even her dreams. She was from Ohio, you see, all that green, all those trees. This place was hard on her." Eleanor's hands, which had been folded on the table, shifted slightly. Her index finger traced a small pattern on the wood, back and forth, back and forth. She tried, though, Lord knows she tried, planted a garden every spring, even though the wind and the drought killed it more often than not. Said she'd make this place bloom if it killed her. He paused, swallowing hard. The blizzard came out of nowhere that day. She'd gone to help the Andersons with their new baby. I should have gone to fetch her when the weather turned, but I thought she'd stay put. Wait it out. She tried to make it home instead. The pattern Eleanor traced on the table had become more complex, circles within circles. Her eyes remained fixed on her moving finger, but he could tell she was listening. Found her the next morning, less than a mile from home. She'd gotten turned around in the white, walked in circles until... He stopped, unable to finish. Eleanor's hand stilled. Then, so slowly he almost missed it. She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but placing hers near enough that he could feel the warmth of it. They sat that way until the lamp burned low and the storm began to exhaust itself against the morning. After that night, something shifted between them. The silence remained, but it had a different quality, less like a wall, more like a held breath. Eleanor began to show small signs of, not comfort exactly, but accommodation. She would sit with him in the evenings sometimes instead of immediately retreating to the bedroom. Once, he caught her almost smiling at the antics of a young rooster chasing a grasshopper around the yard. Then came the night he woke to find her by the stove, tears streaming silently down her face. She wasn't sobbing. There was no sound at all, but her shoulders shook with the effort of containing whatever grief consumed her. Caleb lay still on his pallet, unsure whether acknowledging her pain would make it worse. In the end, he simply closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, giving her the privacy of her sorrow. The next morning, she placed a cup of coffee beside him with what might have been gentleness, her fingers brushing his hand for just a moment before she withdrew. Days turned to weeks, and Caleb found himself watching for these small signs, these tiny cracks in her armor. He began leaving small offerings of his own, wildflowers on the table, a particularly smooth river stone on the windowsill, a jar of honey bought from a neighbor as a luxury. She never acknowledged these gestures directly, but the flowers always found their way into a cup of water. The stone moved to different windows as if following the sun. The honey appeared in the cornbread she'd learned to make. The question haunted him, though. Why wouldn't she speak? At night, lying on his pallet, he invented histories for her. Perhaps she'd taken a vow of silence for religious reasons. Perhaps she'd been injured somehow, her voice stolen by illness or accident. Or perhaps, and this thought always made his chest tight, perhaps someone had given her reason to believe her words held no value. One afternoon, returning early from checking the fence lines, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Sound from inside the cabin, not speech, but humming. A low, almost inaudible melody that ceased the moment his boot hit the porch step. When he entered, Eleanor stood at the wash basin, her face as composed as ever, but there was a faint flush on her cheeks that told him he hadn't imagined it. "That was pretty," he said quietly. "The song." She turned away, but not before he saw something flicker across her face. Embarrassment? Fear? He couldn't tell, but he filed the moment away with all the other small mysteries she'd allowed him to glimpse. That evening, emboldened by the memory of her humming, he did something he hadn't done since Martha died. He pulled out his father's old fiddle from the trunk beneath his bed, Rosine the bow, and began to play. The instrument was out of tune, his fingers stiff from years of neglect, but slowly the melody emerged, an old hymn his mother used to sing. Eleanor emerged from the bedroom, drawn by the music. She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked fully present, fully alive. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her lips parted as if words were gathering there. Waiting. But then a shadow crossed her face, and she pressed her lips together so hard they went white. She shook her head, at him, at herself, and retreated to the bedroom, closing the door with a finality that made him lower the fiddle with a sigh. Still, he'd seen it, that moment when she'd almost spoken, when whatever held her silent had almost loosened its grip. It gave him hope, and hope, he was learning, could sustain a man through even the deepest silence. That night, the coyotes sang closer than usual, their eerie chorus carrying on the wind. Caleb lay awake listening, wondering if Eleanor heard them too, if she lay in the narrow bed counting their calls like he counted the spaces between her silences. Tomorrow, he decided, he would try the fiddle again, and the day after that, as many days as it took for whatever words she carried to find their way free. The land could be patient with its secrets. He was learning he could be, too. The accident happened on a clear October morning when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the sharp promise of winter. Caleb had been breaking a new Mustang, a spirited bay mare he'd captured in the high country. She was green and skittish, fighting the rope at every turn, and perhaps he should have known better than to push her so hard so soon. The mare reared just as he was adjusting his grip, her powerful neck catching him square in the shoulder and sending him tumbling. His boot caught in the stirrup for one terrifying moment before he wrenched free, hitting the ground hard enough to drive all breath from his lungs. The mare bolted, leaving him sprawled in the dust with his left arm twisted beneath him and blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. He lay there for several minutes, waiting for the world to stop spinning, before slowly pushing himself upright. His arm screamed protest, not broken, thank God, but badly wrenched. Blood dripped steadily into his eye from the head wound. Every movement sent lightning through his shoulder as he stumbled toward the cabin, leading his patient gelding with his good hand. Eleanor must have seen him coming. She met him at the door, and for the first time since her arrival, he saw genuine alarm crack through her composure. Her hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide as she took in the blood, the way he cradled his injured arm. "It's not as bad as it looks," he managed, though the gray edges creeping into his vision suggested otherwise. She was already moving, guiding him to a chair with gentle but insistent hands. Within moments she had water heating on the stove, clean cloths assembled, her movements swift and sure as any doctor's. She worked in her characteristic silence, but her touch spoke volumes, the careful way she cleaned the head wound, the gentleness with which she examined his shoulder, rotating it slowly while watching his face for signs of pain. When she began unbuttoning his torn shirt to better assess the damage, Caleb caught her wrist with his good hand. "I can manage," he said, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the situation. She looked at him steadily, then very deliberately shook her head. Her free hand pointed to his shoulder, then made a gesture he couldn't misinterpret. She needed to see the injury. After a moment's hesitation, he released her wrist. She helped him out of the shirt with clinical efficiency, but he noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as they ghosted over the purple bruising already spreading across his shoulder and ribs. She soaked cloths in the warm water, adding something from a small bottle in her trunk that filled the air with the sharp scent of herbs. As she worked, Caleb found himself studying her face, closer to her than he'd been since that night in the dust storm. This near, he could see the faint freckles across her nose, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, a thin scar near her hairline that spoke of her own past injuries. Her eyes, so often distant, were focused entirely on him now, and in them he saw not just concern, but something deeper, more complex. "Thank you," he said softly as she secured a bandage around his ribs. She paused, her hand still on the wrapping, and looked up at him. Their faces were inches apart, close enough that he could feel her breath, see the gold flecks in her gray eyes. For a moment, the air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibility. Then she pulled back, busying herself with collecting the bloodied cloths. But as she turned away, he caught her hand. "Eleanor," he said, and her name felt significant on his lips, weighted with all the questions he'd never asked. "What's your full name? I realize I don't even know that much about you." She stood frozen for a long moment, her hand still in his. Then she gently extracted herself and moved to the shelf where he kept his meager supply of paper and ink. She wrote carefully, deliberately, then placed the paper on the table beside him. Eleanor Grace Whitlock. He stared at the neat script, this first voluntary communication beyond gestures and nods. "Eleanor Grace," he repeated softly. "That's a beautiful name." Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, that he found anything about her beautiful. She took the paper back and added another line. "Thank you for your kindness." He almost laughed, though his ribs protested. I've just done what anyone would do." She shook her head firmly and wrote again. "Not anyone, not everyone." The weight of those words, the world of hurt they implied, made his chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with his injuries. He wanted to ask more, to understand what had brought her to his door wrapped in such impenetrable silence. But something in her posture warned him that this small opening was all she could manage for now. Over the following days, as his injuries slowly healed, Eleanor took on more of the daily chores. She wouldn't let him lift anything heavy, shooting him stern looks when he tried to resume his normal routine too quickly. In the evenings, she began bringing the paper and ink to the table, sometimes writing brief responses to his questions. "Yes, I can ride a horse. No, I've never seen mountains this tall. The coffee is fine. I've had worse." That last one had almost made him smile. He began leaving questions of his own, written on scraps of paper for her to find. "Do you like music?" Her response, "Yes, very much." "Is there anything special you'd like from town?" Her response, "Books, if they have any." It became a slow, careful dance of communication. He learned she was from Missouri originally, that she could read and write better than most men he knew, that she knew how to preserve food and treat basic injuries. But always, his deeper questions went unanswered. Why had she come west? Why wouldn't she speak? What had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement for a bride? One evening, emboldened by the whiskey he'd taken for his still-aching ribs, he wrote, "Were you happy before?" She stared at the paper for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, with deliberate strokes, she wrote a single word. "No." The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Caleb's injuries healed, leaving only a faint scar on his forehead and an ache in his shoulder when storms approached. He resumed his work with the horses, though more carefully now, always aware of Eleanor watching from the window or the porch. Sometimes he caught her standing alone in the yard, face turned up to the sky, lips moving as if in prayer or practice. Once, he was certain he heard her whisper something to the chickens as she scattered their feed, but the words were too soft to make out. The breakthrough came, paradoxically, in a moment of crisis. Caleb had ridden out to check on a reported wolf kill, leaving Eleanor alone at the cabin. When he returned near dusk, he found her pressed against the side of the barn, eyes wide with terror as his nearest neighbor, Jack Harrison, stood too close, his words slurred with drink. "Just being neighborly," Harrison was saying, reaching for her arm. Wanted to meet the woman who won't talk. Maybe you just need the right kind of encouragement. Step away from her." Caleb's voice was deadly quiet as he dismounted. Harrison turned, swaying slightly. "Rawlins, just having a friendly chat with your woman, though it ain't much of a chat when she won't. I said step away." Something in Caleb's tone must have penetrated Harrison's drunken haze. He raised his hands in mock surrender, backing toward his horse. "No harm meant, though you might want to teach her some manners. Ain't natural. A woman who won't speak to her neighbors." After Harrison rode off, Caleb found Eleanor trembling against the barn wall, her face pale as parchment. Without thinking, he reached for her, meaning only to offer comfort. But she collapsed against him, her silent sobs shaking her entire frame. "It's all right," he murmured, holding her carefully, mindful of her boundaries even in this moment. "He's gone. I won't let him come back here." She pulled back enough to look up at him, tears streaming down her face, and he saw her mouth form words she couldn't or wouldn't voice. Her hands clutched his shirt, and in her eyes he saw not just fear, but a desperate need to be understood. "I know," he said quietly, though he didn't, not really. "Whatever it is, whatever happened to you before, you're safe here. I promise you that." She studied his face for a long moment, then reached up with one trembling hand to touch the scar on his forehead. The one she had tended. Her lips parted, and for a breathless moment he thought she might finally speak. Instead, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his cheek, a touch as light as a butterfly's wing, before fleeing into the cabin. Caleb stood alone in the gathering darkness, his hand rising unconsciously to the spot her lips had touched. In the months since Eleanor's arrival, he'd grown accustomed to her silence, had even found a kind of peace in it. But now, for the first time, he felt the true weight of all the words she couldn't say, all the stories locked behind her sealed lips. That night, he made a decision. He pulled out paper and ink and wrote a longer message than usual. "You don't have to tell me what happened. You don't have to speak if you're not ready. But I want you to know that you have a home here for as long as you want it. Not because of any bargain made through the mail, not because of promises to my mother, but because you belong here now. The ranch is better with you in it. I'm better with you in it." He left the note on the table where she would find it in the morning, then made up his pallet by the stove as always. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, he dreamed not of Martha's voice calling through the snow, but of Eleanor's silence breaking like spring ice on the river, releasing a flood of words that had been waiting too long to flow free. The blizzard came without warning on a gray December afternoon. Caleb had ridden out to bring in some strays from the north pasture, the sky heavy but not threatening when he'd left. Within an hour, the temperature plummeted and the first fat snowflakes began to fall. By the time he'd gathered the cattle and started pushing them toward home, the wind had picked up to a howl and the snow fell in thick, blinding curtains. He knew these storms, knew how quickly they could turn deadly. Martha's face flashed before his eyes, but he pushed the memory away, focusing on the barely visible rumps of the cattle ahead. The familiar landmarks disappeared one by one into the white void. Soon he was navigating by instinct alone, trusting his horse to find the way home. The cold was brutal, seeping through his coat and gloves until his fingers could barely grip the reins. Ice formed on his beard and eyelashes. More than once, he thought he was lost, turned around in the featureless white landscape, but he kept moving, knowing that to stop was to die. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Eleanor had watched the storm roll in with growing dread. She'd kept the fire high and placed a lamp in the window, its feeble light swallowed by the driving snow. As the hours passed with no sign of Caleb, her composure began to crack. She paced the small cabin, pausing at the window every few moments to peer into the white, nothing beyond. Her hands twisted together, knuckles white with tension. Several times she reached for her shawl, meaning to go search for him, but the rational part of her mind knew it would be suicide. She could barely see the barn from the window. To venture farther would mean certain death. Night fell, though it was hard to tell in the midst of the storm. Eleanor's fear transformed into something closer to panic. She pressed her face against the cold glass, straining for any sign of movement in the white chaos. Her breath fogged the window, and she wiped it impatiently with her sleeve. That's when she saw it, a dark shape materializing from the storm. Her heart leaped, then sank as she realized it was just a cow, lowing miserably as it sought shelter against the side of the barn. Then another shape appeared, and another. The cattle were coming home, and behind them, barely visible, a figure on horseback. Eleanor flew to the door, wrenching it open despite the wind that tried to tear it from her hands. Snow swirled into the cabin, but she didn't care. She grabbed the extra lantern and held it high, a beacon in the darkness. Caleb saw the light and felt something loosen in his chest. Home. He was almost home. His horse stumbled the last few yards to the cabin, and he half fell from the saddle, his legs numb and uncooperative. Eleanor was there instantly, her small frame surprisingly strong as she supported his weight. Together they staggered into the cabin, her kicking the door shut behind them. Caleb collapsed into a chair, shaking uncontrollably. Ice crusted on every surface of his clothing. "Cold," he managed through chattering teeth. Eleanor's hands flew over him, assessing. His clothes were frozen nearly solid, his face gray with cold. Without hesitation, she began stripping the frozen garments from him, coat, gloves, boots. When she reached for his shirt buttons, his numb fingers tried to help but couldn't manage the simple task. She batted his hands away impatiently and made quick work of the buttons herself. The shirt was damp with snow and sweat, clinging to his skin. She peeled it away, then paused at his union suit, clearly torn between propriety and necessity. "Please," he whispered, his whole body shaking. So cold. That decided her, with clinical efficiency. She stripped him down to his drawers, then wrapped him in every blanket she could find. She pulled his chair closer to the stove, then set about making coffee laced heavily with the whiskey she'd found in his stores. But the shaking wouldn't stop. His lips were still tinged blue, his skin like ice, despite the blankets. Eleanor bit her lip, clearly wrestling with a decision. Then, with sudden determination, she loosened her own dress and petticoats, stripping down to her chemise and bloomers. Before Caleb could process what was happening, she had crawled under the blankets with him, pressing her warm body against his frozen one. The shock of it, of her, this silent, untouchable woman suddenly in his arms, momentarily drove all other thoughts from his mind. She was so warm, so soft, and she held him with fierce determination, her hands rubbing his arms and back to restore circulation. "Eleanor," he breathed against her hair. She pulled back enough to look at him, and what he saw in her eyes made his heart stutter. Fear, yes, but also determination, and something else. Something that looked like the possibility of loss had finally broken through whatever walls she'd built around herself. Her lips parted, trembling with the effort of forming words so long unspoken. "Don't," she whispered, her voice hoarse and cracked from disuse. "Don't leave me. Leave." The sound of her voice, low, rough, but unmistakably real, hit him like a physical blow. "Eleanor," he said again, his hand rising to cup her face despite the trembling of his fingers. "You spoke." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I thought, when you didn't come back, I thought I'd lost you too." "Too?" he asked gently, but she shook her head, pressing closer against him. "Just hold me," she whispered. "Please, just hold me." He did, wrapping his arms around her as the warmth slowly returned to his body. They lay entwined before the stove, the storm raging outside, her tears dampening his chest. Gradually, his shaking subsided, replaced by a different kind of tension entirely. He became acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. Her legs tangled with his, her breasts pressed against his chest through the thin fabric of her chemise, her breath warm against his neck. She seemed to become aware of it at the same moment, her body stilling against his. "Eleanor," he began, but she silenced him with a finger against his lips. I know this is improper, she whispered, her voice still rough. But when I thought you might be dead. She broke off, fresh tears spilling over. Shh, he soothed, stroking her hair. I'm here. I'm all right. She lifted her head to look at him, and in the firelight her face was luminous with emotion. I've been dead inside for so long, she whispered. But you made me feel alive again. And tonight, when I thought— She stopped, swallowing hard. I can't be dead inside anymore. I won't. The air between them crackled with tension. Caleb's hand came up to trace the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing away her tears. Eleanor, he said roughly. We don't have to. She silenced him with a kiss, awkward and desperate and perfect. Her lips were soft and tasted of tears, and when she opened to him, he groaned deep in his throat. His hands tangled in her hair, pins scattering across the floor as the dark mass tumbled free. Are you certain? He asked when they broke apart, both breathing hard. Instead of answering, she took his hand and placed it over her heart. He could feel it racing beneath his palm, matching the thundering of his own. I'm certain, she whispered. For the first time in years, I'm certain of something. What followed was careful and tender and shot through with a desperate kind of need. They moved together on the narrow pallet before the fire, skin against skin, every touch a revelation. Eleanor was shy at first, her inexperience showing despite her previous marriage. But as Caleb worshipped her with gentle hands and lips, she began to open like a flower in the sun. When he paused, concerned about moving too fast, she pulled him down for another kiss. Please, she breathed against his mouth. I need to feel alive. I need to feel you. They came together with a shared gasp, bodies trembling for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. Caleb was achingly gentle, watching her face for any sign of discomfort. But Eleanor's eyes were wide with wonder, her hands clutching his shoulders as they moved together in the ancient rhythm. Look at me, he whispered when her eyes fluttered closed. Stay with me. She did, holding his gaze as they climbed together toward release. When it crashed over them, she cried out, the first full-throated sound he'd heard from her, and he swallowed the sound with a kiss, his own groan mingling with hers. Afterward, they lay entwined, sweat cooling on their skin despite the heat from the stove. Eleanor traced patterns on his chest, her fingers dancing over old scars and new plains. I haven't, not since, she began, then stopped. You don't have to explain, Caleb said softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. But I want to, she said, her voice growing stronger with use. You deserve to know. My husband, my first husband, he was cruel. He liked my silence, when I spoke up, when I disagreed. She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. After he died, I swore I'd never give another man that power over me, so I stopped speaking altogether. Caleb's arms tightened around her. I'm not him, he said fiercely. I know. She tilted her face up to look at him. You're nothing like him. You gave me space to be silent, and somehow that made me want to speak again. They talked through the night as the storm gradually exhausted itself. Eleanor's voice grew clearer with each hour, as if the rust was slowly flaking away. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, her love of books and music, her dreams of children that had died with her first pregnancy. He told her about Martha, about the guilt he'd carried, about the loneliness that had eaten at him like acid. When dawn broke, pale and crystalline through the frost-covered windows, they were still talking, still touching, still discovering each other. The world outside was transformed, buried under feet of pristine snow. But inside the cabin, something else had been transformed entirely. Eleanor rose to tend the fire, unself-conscious now in her state of undress. Caleb watched her move, marveling at the change, not just in her willingness to speak, but in the way she carried herself, no longer hunched and guarded, but standing straight and sure. She caught him looking and smiled, a real smile that lit up her entire face. What are you thinking? She asked. That I almost didn't come back last night. he said honestly. That if I'd given up, turned the wrong way. She returned to the pallet, curling against his side. But you didn't, she said firmly. You came home. To me. To you. He agreed, and kissed her again, slow and deep and full of promise. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, setting the snow-covered world ablaze with diamond light. But inside the cabin, wrapped in each other and the warmth of new beginning, Caleb and Eleanor barely noticed. They had weathered their own storm, and, in its aftermath, found something neither had dared hope for, a second chance at love, and the courage to reach for it with both hands. The morning after the storm dawned brilliant and sharp. The world transformed into a crystalline wonderland. Caleb woke to find Eleanor already up, wrapped in a blanket, making coffee at the stove. When she heard him stir, she turned with a shy smile that made his heart skip. Good morning, she said softly, her voice still hoarse but growing clearer. Morning, he replied, still marveling at the simple miracle of her speech. How long have you been awake? Not long. I wanted to watch the sunrise. It's beautiful on the snow. She brought him coffee, then surprised him by settling beside him on the pallet instead of retreating to a chair. Are you warm enough? More than warm enough, he said, pulling her close. They sat in comfortable silence, a different silence than before, one filled with possibility rather than barriers. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. I should tell you the rest, she said quietly. About before, about why I came west. Only if you want to, Caleb said, though he admitted to himself that he burned to know what had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement. She took a deep breath. My husband, Theodore Whitlock, was a respected merchant in St. Louis. Everyone thought him such a gentleman, but behind closed doors, she paused, her fingers tightening on her coffee cup. He was particular about everything. How I dressed, how I spoke, who I could see. When I failed to meet his standards, he would correct me. Caleb's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, letting her tell it in her own time. At first, I tried to be perfect, but nothing was ever good enough. When I told him I was expecting a child, I thought things might change. He seemed pleased, even gentle for a while. But when I lost the baby, her voice broke. He blamed me, said I was too weak, too fragile. The corrections became worse. Eleanor, Caleb said roughly, but she shook her head. Let me finish. I need to say it all. She drew another breath. One night, I spoke back, told him he was cruel. He flew into such a rage. I thought he would kill me. I ran into the street, screaming for help, but the neighbors just closed their doors. A respectable man disciplining his wife was no one's business. Tears tracked down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. After that night, I stopped speaking, not a word. It enraged him at first, but then he seemed to prefer it. A silent wife couldn't embarrass him at social gatherings, couldn't contradict him, couldn't cry out. How did you get away? Caleb asked, his voice thick with suppressed anger. He died, she said simply. Apoplexy. The doctor said, one moment he was shouting at me for burning his dinner, the next he was on the floor, clutching his chest. I just stood there, watched him die, didn't call for help, didn't speak, just watched. She looked at him then, as if expecting judgment, but Caleb only pulled her closer. Good, he said fiercely. I'm glad he's dead. A startled laugh escaped her. His brother arrived for the funeral, started making noise about taking over Theodore's estate and his widow. That's when I saw the advertisement for mail-order brides. I took what money I could, bought a train ticket, and never looked back. I thought if I went far enough away, stayed silent enough, I could disappear, become no one. You're not no one, Caleb said, turning her face up to his. You're Eleanor Grace Whitlock, the bravest woman I've ever known. Fresh tears spilled over, but she was smiling through them. I don't feel brave, especially not last night, when you were lost in the storm. All I could think was that I'd wasted so much time being afraid, that I'd never told you." She stopped, color flooding her cheeks. "Told me what?" he prompted gently. "That somewhere between your patient silences and your fiddle playing and the way you look at me like I'm whole instead of broken, I fell in love with you." The words hung between them, precious and terrifying. Caleb set down his coffee with shaking hands and cupped her face between his palms. "Eleanor," he said roughly, "I need you to know something. What happened last night, it wasn't just the cold or the fear. I've been falling for you since the day you stood up to that dust storm without saying a word. You don't need words to speak to my heart." She kissed him then, deep and desperate, and they tumbled back onto the pallet together. This time their lovemaking was less desperate but no less intense. A claiming and a promise all at once. They moved together with perfect understanding. Bodies speaking the truths their voices had only just learned to share. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Eleanor traced the scar on his forehead. "I wanted to speak that day," she admitted. "When you fell from the horse, I wanted to ask if you were all right, to tell you to be careful. The words were right there, but I couldn't. You spoke with your hands." Caleb reminded her, "With your care, I heard you." They spent the morning like newlyweds, unable to stop touching, kissing, marveling at the change between them. Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each hour of use, and she seemed determined to make up for months of silence. She told him about books she'd read, places she'd dreamed of seeing, her favorite songs from childhood. "Will you teach them to me?" Caleb asked. "For the fiddle." Her face lit up. "You do that? Learn songs for me?" "I'd do anything for you," he said simply, and meant it. They ventured out in the afternoon to tend the stock. Eleanor bundled in an old coat of Caleb's that swallowed her small frame. She laughed, actually laughed, when she tried to walk through the deep snow and ended up hip-deep in a drift. The sound was rusty but genuine, and Caleb thought he'd never heard anything more beautiful. "Carry me?" she asked, holding out her arms with a mischievous smile that transformed her face. He swept her up easily, carrying her through the worst of the drifts while she clung to his neck, pressing kisses to his jaw. The cattle lowed at them reproachfully, hungry and cold. But for a moment, Caleb didn't care about anything but the woman in his arms. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Eleanor grew serious again. "Caleb," she said carefully, "what happens now? I mean, we're not truly married. The agency arranged a meeting, but we never—" "We'll go to town as soon as the roads are clear," he said immediately. "Find the preacher, do things proper, if that's what you want." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "But what is it?" She worried her lower lip between her teeth. "Theodore's brother, Harold, he made threats before I left, said I belonged to the family, that Theodore's estate was rightfully his to manage, including me. I don't know if he'll try to find me." Caleb's face hardened. "Let him try. This is Wyoming territory, not St. Louis. A man protects what's his out here, and you're under my protection now." "Yours?" she asked softly. He pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "Mine," he confirmed. "If you'll have me. Not as some arrangement made through the mail, but as a real marriage, real love." "Yes," she breathed against his lips. "Yes, to all of it." They made love again before the dying fire, slow and tender, sealing promises with touch and taste and whispered endearments. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they moved to the bedroom together for the first time, the narrow bed that had been Eleanor's solitary refuge becoming their shared haven. In the days that followed, as the snow slowly melted and the roads became passable, they settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor found her voice in increments, sometimes chattering happily as she worked, other times falling into comfortable silence. But it was a chosen silence now, not a prison. She began teaching him songs on the fiddle, her voice lifting in harmony as he played. She wrote letters to order books from Denver, planning to teach any children they might have, and perhaps some of the neighbor children too. She even began speaking to the chickens again, this time loud enough for him to hear her gentle scolding and encouragement. The first time they went to town together after the storm. Eleanor held tight to Caleb's arm, nervous about facing the people who'd known her only as the silent mail-order bride. But when Agnes Fletcher started her usual gossiping, Eleanor surprised everyone, including herself, by speaking up. "Good morning, Mrs. Fletcher," she said clearly. "Lovely weather we're having after that storm." Agnes's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with shock. You can speak." "Yes," Eleanor said with a serene smile. "I simply needed the right reason to—" She looked up at Caleb as she said it, her meaning unmistakable. Agnes flushed and hurried away, no doubt to spread this latest gossip. But Eleanor didn't care. She had found her voice again, and with it, the courage to claim her place in this small community. That night, as they lay together in their bed, truly theirs now, Eleanor whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" Caleb asked, stroking her hair. "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for waiting until I was ready, for catching me when I fell, literally and figuratively." "Thank you," he countered, "for choosing to fall in my direction." She laughed softly, the sound still a miracle to his ears. "I love you, Caleb Rollins. And I love you, Eleanor Grace, soon-to-be Rollins." Outside, the winter wind howled across the plains, but inside their small cabin, all was warmth and light and the quiet joy of two souls who had found their way through silence to a love that needed no words, though they rejoiced in having them anyway. The first shoots of spring were just beginning to push through the melting snow when Eleanor planted her garden. She worked the soil with determined strokes, her sleeves rolled up, dirt smudging her cheek where she'd brushed away a strand of hair. Caleb watched from the porch, marveling at the transformation in her. Not just her newfound voice, but the way she moved through the world now, confident and sure. "Tomatoes here," she was saying, half to herself, half to him. "Beans along the fence where they can climb, and perhaps some flowers. Would you mind if I planted flowers, Caleb?" "Plant whatever makes you happy," he called back, meaning it wholly. She flashed him a smile that still made his heart race. Even months after that night in the storm, they'd been properly married by the circuit preacher on a crisp January morning, with Sam Murphy and his wife as witnesses. Eleanor had worn her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the gray in her eyes, and spoken her vows in a clear, strong voice that had brought tears to more than one eye in the small congregation. Now, as winter gave way to spring, their life together had settled into rhythms both new and comfortable. Eleanor had taken to the ranching life with surprising enthusiasm, learning to ride on Caleb's gentlest mare, helping with the calving, even attempting to break a young colt, though Caleb had put a stop to that after she'd been thrown into a particularly muddy puddle, emerging, sputtering and laughing. "Eleanor Rollins," he'd scolded, trying to sound stern despite his relief that she was unhurt. "You'll give me gray hair before my time." "You already have gray hair," she'd pointed out, still dripping. "Besides, you can't protect me from everything." "I can try," he'd muttered. But he'd known she was right. Part of loving Eleanor meant accepting her newfound determination to experience everything life had denied her during her years of silence and fear. The changes in her went beyond the physical. She'd begun teaching letters to the Anderson children twice a week, their parents grateful for the education they couldn't provide themselves. Word had spread about the transformed mail-order bride, and other families had shyly inquired about lessons for their own children. "We could use the barn," Eleanor had suggested one evening. "Set up a proper schoolroom. I have enough books now, and we could order slates from Denver." Caleb had agreed, partly because he could deny her nothing when her eyes lit up that way, but mostly because he loved seeing her find her purpose. The woman who had arrived silent and shut away was becoming a pillar of their small community. But the past, as Caleb had learned, didn't always stay buried. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, riding a fine black horse and wearing clothes too fancy for the frontier. Caleb was in the far pasture, mending fence, when he saw the rider approach the cabin. Something about the man's bearing set off warning bells, and he abandoned his work, spurring his horse toward home. By the time he arrived, Eleanor was on the porch, her face pale as fresh paper. The stranger had dismounted but kept his distance, hat in his hands, speaking in a voice that carried clear across the yard. Told you this wasn't over. Eleanor, my brother's estate requires proper settling. You can't simply disappear and expect— That's far enough. Caleb swung down from his horse, positioning himself between Eleanor and the stranger. State your business, Mr. The man, Harold Whitlock, it had to be, turned cool eyes on Caleb. He was younger than Theodore would have been, perhaps 40, with the soft look of a man who'd never worked with his hands. My business is with Mrs. Whitlock, Harold said smoothly. Family business that doesn't concern Mrs. Rollins, Caleb corrected firmly. My wife, which makes her business my business. Harold's expression soured. I see. Eleanor, you've remarried hastily, but that doesn't negate your obligations. Theodore's estate. Theodore left me nothing but bruises and nightmares. Eleanor's voice cut through the afternoon air, sharp as winter wind. She stepped around Caleb, though he noticed she kept within arm's reach. I took only what was mine by rights. My mother's jewelry, my clothes, enough money for passage west, nothing more. The law might see it differently, Harold said, producing a sheaf of papers from his coat. As Theodore's brother and only living relative, I have certain claims. The only claim you have, Eleanor interrupted, her voice gaining strength, is to the property and assets in St. Louis. I signed no papers, inherited nothing, took nothing that belonged to your family. And if you think I'll return with you to be managed like a piece of property, you're gravely mistaken. Harold's face flushed. You were Theodore's wife. In the eyes of society. Society closed its doors when I screamed for help. Eleanor said quietly, I owe it nothing. Caleb felt fierce pride in his wife's strength, but he could see the toll this confrontation was taking. Her hands trembled slightly, and there was a tightness around her eyes that spoke of old fears rising. Mr. Whitlock, Caleb said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You've had your say. My wife has given you her answer. I think it's time you moved on. Harold's eyes narrowed. And if I choose to pursue this legally, Wyoming territory has laws. It does. Caleb agreed. Laws that protect wives from men who would treat them as chattel. Laws that recognize a woman's right to leave an abusive situation. Would you like to test those laws? Because I assure you, every person in this community would testify to my wife's character and her right to the life she's built here. As if to underscore his point, the sound of approaching horses made them all turn. Sam Murphy rode up, flanked by Tom Anderson and 2 other neighbors, all armed, all wearing expressions that suggested they'd tolerate no trouble in their community. Everything all right here, Rollins? Murphy called out, his hand resting casually on his rifle. Just fine, Sam, Caleb replied, not taking his eyes off Harold. Mr. Whitlock was just leaving. Harold looked from Caleb to the assembled men, then back to Eleanor. Something shifted in his expression. Perhaps he saw the futility of his position, or perhaps he simply realized that the frightened, silent woman his brother had terrorized no longer existed. This isn't over, he said finally, but the threat sounded hollow. The family's reputation is your concern, not mine, Eleanor said firmly. I have a new family now, a real one. Harold mounted his fine horse with stiff dignity, but before he could ride away, Eleanor called out, Harold. He turned, perhaps hoping for capitulation. Theodore died calling for me, she said quietly, calling for the wife he'd silenced. I stood there, watching him die, and I said nothing, not out of cruelty, but because he'd beaten the words out of me long before. Don't follow his path. Find a woman who'll speak to you freely, love you truly. It's not too late for you to be better than he was. Harold's face worked through several emotions before settling on something that might have been shame. Without another word, he spurred his horse toward town, the dust of his departure settling slowly in the afternoon air. The neighbors lingered, making sure the threat had truly passed. Eleanor thanked each one personally, her voice steady now, though Caleb could see the exhaustion creeping in. When they were alone again, she sagged against him. "I thought seeing him would make me mute again," she confessed. "I thought the fear would steal my words." "But it didn't," Caleb said, holding her close. "You stood up to him. You spoke your truth. I almost couldn't, but then I thought of you, of our life here, of the children I teach and the garden I'm planting and the future we're building. And I knew I couldn't let him take that away. Not with silence. Not with anything." That evening, after the chores were done and the sun had set behind the mountains, they sat together on the porch, Eleanor in Caleb's lap, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Will he come back?" Caleb asked quietly. Eleanor considered. "I don't think so. Harold is many things, but he's not stupid. He saw what I have here, a husband who'd fight for me, neighbors who'd stand with us, a life worth protecting. That's more than Theodore ever gave me. Still," Caleb said, "if he does return, we'll face him together," Eleanor finished. "No more running, no more silence. This is my home now." She turned in his arms to kiss him, soft and sweet with promise. When they parted, she was smiling. "Besides, I have plans for that barn school, and I was thinking, perhaps it's time we worked on filling one of those empty bedrooms. What do you think about starting a family of our own?" Caleb's heart swelled with emotions too complex for words. Instead of answering, he stood, sweeping her up in his arms. "I think," he said, carrying her toward their bedroom, "that's the best idea I've heard in a long time." Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch like music, a testament to all the words that silence couldn't kill and all the joy that love could resurrect. As the door closed behind them, the night settled peaceful over the Wyoming plains, full of promise and the whispered prayers of second chances seized with both hands and grateful hearts. In the months that followed, Harold Whitlock would become nothing more than a distant memory, a final ghost from Eleanor's past laid to rest. But that night, as Caleb and Eleanor came together in their marriage bed with renewed purpose and deep tenderness, they thought only of the future, of children's laughter filling the cabin, of crops growing tall in the garden, of words spoken freely and love given without reservation. The woman who had arrived in silence had found her voice, and with it, she would speak a new life into being. One word, one day, one blessing at a time. The courthouse in Cheyenne was an imposing brick building that seemed to Eleanor to embody all the weight of law and civilization that the frontier usually lacked. She stood on its steps on a humid June morning, her hand clasped tightly in Caleb's, watching as Harold Whitlock ascended with his lawyer, a sharp-faced man from St. Louis who looked as out of place in Wyoming as a peacock among prairie chickens. "We don't have to do this," Caleb murmured. "We could leave, head further west, Oregon, maybe, or California." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "No more running," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "I found my voice. Now I need to use it." Harold had returned, as they'd feared he might, but this time with legal papers and a formal suit claiming that Eleanor had absconded with property belonging to Theodore's estate. More troubling. He'd brought documentation asserting his rights as legal guardian over his brother's widow, an old Missouri law that hadn't been tested in the territories but which his lawyer seemed confident would hold. Their own lawyer, Mr. Charles Pemberton, met them in the courthouse lobby. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, with earnest brown eyes and ink stains on his fingers. "Mrs. Rollins, Mr. Rollins." He greeted them. "I've reviewed the documents again. Their claim is unusual. They're essentially arguing that under Missouri law, a widow's property and person remain under the protection, they use that word deliberately, of her late husband's family." "Protection," Eleanor said bitterly. "Is that what they called it when Theodore broke my ribs?" Pemberton's expression softened. "That's exactly why we'll win this, ma'am. But I need you to be prepared. They'll try to paint you as hysterical, unstable. They'll question your remarriage, suggest you were eager to find a new protector. Let them." Caleb growled, but Eleanor touched his arm gently. "I know what they'll say," she told the lawyer. "I've been preparing for weeks." Indeed, she had. Word of the lawsuit had spread through their small community like wildfire, and support had come from unexpected quarters. Women who had never spoken to her beyond pleasantries had come forward with their own stories, their own scars. Men who had seemed indifferent to the quiet mail-order bride now spoke fiercely of the dedicated teacher their children adored. The courtroom was packed when they entered. Eleanor recognized many faces from Mercy's Bend and surrounding homesteads. The Andersons, the Murphys, even gruff old Walter Hutchins, who never came to town except for supplies. Their presence steadied her as she took her seat. Judge Martin Prescott was a stern-faced man with silver mutton chops, who looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else. He called the court to order with sharp raps of his gavel, his expression suggesting he found this entire matter distasteful. Harold's lawyer, Mr. Cornelius Ashford, presented his case with oily confidence. He painted a picture of a bereaved family concerned for a widow's welfare, of property rightfully belonging to the Whitlock estate, of a woman so traumatized by her husband's sudden death that she'd fled in an irrational state. "We seek only to ensure the former Mrs. Whitlock is properly cared for," Ashford concluded. "That any assets belonging to the estate are returned, and that she receives the guidance and protection her late husband would have wanted her to have." Eleanor felt her hands clench in her lap as Ashford spoke, but she kept her face composed. She'd learned during her years of silence how to hide her emotions behind a mask of calm. Now, though, she had to trust that when the time came, she could let that mask fall. Pemberton's defense was methodical and precise. He established Eleanor's right to travel freely, to remarry, to begin a new life. He presented receipts showing that the money she'd taken was from an account in her name, funded by the sale of jewelry that had belonged to her mother. He called witnesses to testify to her character, her work in the community, her stable and loving marriage to Caleb. But Eleanor knew none of that would be enough, not until she spoke for herself. When Pemberton called her to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She rose on unsteady legs, smoothing her gray wool dress. She'd chosen it deliberately, severe and respectable. As she took the witness stand, she caught Caleb's eye. He nodded once, his faith in her shining clear. "Mrs. Rollins," Pemberton began gently, "would you tell the court about your marriage to Theodore Whitlock?" Eleanor took a breath, feeling the weight of all those listening ears. For a moment, the old silence beckoned, safe, protective, familiar. Then she thought of her students, of the women who had shared their own stories with her, of Caleb's patient love, and she began to speak. "Theodore Whitlock was considered a pillar of St. Louis society," she said, her voice starting soft but growing stronger. "A successful merchant, a generous donor to charitable causes, a man of impeccable reputation in public." She paused, meeting Harold's eyes directly. "In private, he was a monster." Ashford objected immediately. "Your Honor, the witness is speaking ill of the dead, making claims that cannot be substantiated." Overruled. Judge Prescott said curtly, "The witness may continue." Eleanor gripped the rail of the witness box. "Theodore required perfection in all things. When I failed to meet his standards, when dinner was late, when I spoke to a neighbor without permission, when I failed to give him a child, he corrected me, with his fists, with his belt, with whatever was at hand." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Someone, she thought it was Mrs. Anderson, let out a soft sound of sympathy. "I tried to get help," Eleanor continued. "I ran into the street once, screaming, bleeding from a cut above my eye. The neighbors closed their doors. The police told me a man had the right to discipline his wife. The pastor counseled me to be more obedient, more submissive, to pray harder." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. After I lost the baby, after Theodore beat me so badly I lost the baby, I stopped speaking. Not a word. For 2 years. I said nothing. It wasn't a choice at first. The words simply wouldn't come. But then Theodore realized he preferred me silent. A mute wife couldn't embarrass him, couldn't contradict him, couldn't cry for help. Mrs. Rollins, Pemberton prompted gently. What happened when your husband died? He had an apoplectic fit during one of his rages, Eleanor said simply. He called for me as he lay dying, but I had no words to give him. I watched him die in silence, and I felt— She paused, searching for honesty. I felt free. For the first time in years, I felt I could breathe. And then, Harold arrived for the funeral. He made it clear he intended to take over Theodore's household, including me. He spoke of duty, of family honor, of keeping me under proper supervision. I knew then that my prison was simply changing guards. So I took what was mine, only what was mine, and I ran— Objection! Ashford was on his feet. The witness admits to fleeing with estate property. I took my mother's jewelry, which Theodore had no claim to. Eleanor said firmly, I took clothing I had made or mended with my own hands. I took money from an account my father had established for me before his death. I have receipts for all of it. Your Honor. Judge Prescott nodded for her to continue. I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride because I thought if I went far enough, stayed quiet enough, I could disappear. But then I met Caleb. Her voice softened, and she looked at her husband. He never demanded words from me, never punished my silence. He simply waited, patient as the mountains, until I felt safe enough to speak again. And now, Pemberton asked, now I teach school to ranch children. I have a garden and chickens and a husband who treats me as a partner, not property. I have neighbors who judge me by my actions, not my past. I have a life, Your Honor, a real life, and I will not let anyone take that from me again. The silence that followed her words was profound. Then Ashford rose for cross-examination, his expression calculating. Mrs. Rollins. He began smoothly. You claim my client's brother was abusive, yet you never filed a single complaint, never sought legal remedy. I sought help, Eleanor interrupted. I was told to go home and be a better wife. You say you took only what was yours, yet you admit to taking money. From my own account, I have documentation. Ashford changed tactics. You remarried with unseemly haste. Some might say you were simply looking for another man to support you. Objection, Pemberton called out. But Eleanor raised her hand. I'll answer. She said, yes, I remarried quickly, because I found a man who saw me as a human being, not a possession. Because I wanted a real marriage, based on love and respect, not fear and control. Because I chose him, freely, and he chose me. Yet you came to him damaged, unstable. I came to him silent, Eleanor corrected, her voice ringing clear. Silence born of pain, not instability, and in his patience and kindness, I found my voice again. That's not damage. Mr. Ashford, that's healing. The cross-examination continued, but Ashford couldn't shake her testimony. When she finally stepped down, Caleb was there to meet her, guiding her back to their seat with gentle hands. The final witness was unexpected. As Pemberton prepared to rest his case, a woman in the back of the courtroom stood. Your Honor, she called out. I'd like to speak. Judge Prescott frowned. Ma'am, you can't simply— Please, the woman said, moving forward. She was elegantly dressed, her graying hair perfectly arranged. My name is Margaret Thornton. I was Theodore Whitlock's neighbor in St. Louis. Eleanor gasped softly. She remembered Mrs. Thornton, the woman who had always averted her eyes, who had closed her door that night. Eleanor ran screaming into the street. This is highly irregular, Ashford protested, but Judge Prescott silenced him with a gesture. What did you want to say? Mrs. Thornton? The judge asked. The woman twisted her hands together. I've traveled all this way because I couldn't live with my conscience any longer. Everything misses. Rollins said is true. We all knew. The whole neighborhood knew what Theodore Whitlock was doing to his wife. We heard the screams, saw the bruises she tried to hide, and we did nothing. Tears streamed down her face. That night she ran into the street, bleeding and terrified. I started to go to her, but my husband stopped me, said it wasn't our business, that Theodore was an important man, that we couldn't afford to make an enemy of him. To my eternal shame, I listened. She turned to Eleanor. I'm so sorry. We all failed you. When I heard Harold was pursuing this suit, claiming guardianship, I knew I had to speak up. I couldn't be a coward twice. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Prescott gavelled for order, his expression thoughtful. After Mrs. Thornton was seated, he called for closing arguments. Ashford did his best, but his polished words rang hollow after the raw honesty of the testimony. Pemberton spoke simply and directly about freedom, about the right of a woman to escape abuse, about the territorial laws that recognized women as individuals, not property. Judge Prescott retired to consider his decision. The wait felt eternal, but in reality, he returned in less than an hour. This court finds, he began, his voice carrying clearly, that Mrs. Eleanor Rollins acted within her legal rights in leaving Missouri and remarrying. The property she took has been documented as rightfully hers. As for the claim of guardianship, he looked directly at Harold. Mr. Whitlock, your brother may have been an important man in St. Louis, but his importance doesn't extend beyond the grave, and it certainly doesn't extend to Wyoming territory. We don't hold with treating women as chattel here. Mrs. Rollins is a free woman, married to a man of her own choosing, contributing to her community. Your suit is dismissed with prejudice. The gavel came down with finality, and the courtroom erupted. Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers, women embracing her with tears in their eyes, men shaking Caleb's hand and clapping him on the back. Through the crowd, she saw Harold leaving with his lawyer, his face a mask of defeat and, perhaps, shame. On impulse, she broke away and caught up with him on the courthouse steps. Harold, she called. He turned, wary. I forgive you, she said simply. Not for my sake, but for yours. Let go of Theodore's poison. Be better than he was. Harold stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once and walked away. Eleanor watched him go, feeling the last chains of her past fall away. Caleb appeared at her elbow. Ready to go home? More than ready, she said, taking his arm. We have a life to build. As they descended the courthouse steps into the bright Wyoming sunshine, Eleanor felt words bubbling up inside her, not the desperate words that had been beaten into silence, but new words, free words, chosen words. She had testified not just for herself, but for all the women still trapped in silence. Her voice had set her free, and perhaps in some small way, it would help set others free too. The journey home was filled with quiet celebration. Their neighbors rode with them part of the way, sharing food and stories, the women especially seeking Eleanor out to press her hand and whisper their own truths. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of triumph. That night, as they lay in their bed, Caleb asked, Do you regret having to relive it all? Eleanor considered, then shook her head. No, I needed to speak it aloud, in public, with the force of law behind my words. Now it's truly over. Now I'm truly free. She turned in his arms, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you for standing by me, for believing I was worth fighting for. Always, he promised, forever and always. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang its ancient song across the plains, and inside, two hearts beat as one, testament to the power of patient love and the courage to speak truth, no matter how long the silence that preceded it. 1 year later, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the barn, now transformed into a proper schoolhouse. Watching her students bend over their slates, the morning sun slanted through the windows Caleb had installed, illuminating the concentrated faces of 8 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Her hand rested unconsciously on the gentle swell of her belly where new life grew, a secret she'd shared with Caleb just the night before. Mrs. Rollins. Little Sarah Anderson piped up. How do you spell happiness? Eleanor moved to the child's desk, her steps careful but sure. Sound it out. Sarah, what do you hear? As the child worked through the letters, Eleanor's mind drifted to all that had changed in the year since the trial. The school had grown from a dream to reality, with families contributing what they could: lumber, nails, time, and labor. The community had embraced her fully, not as the silent mail-order bride, but as their teacher, their neighbor, their friend. After the morning lessons, Eleanor dismissed the children and began the walk back to the cabin. The ranch had prospered under Caleb's careful management, the herd growing, new foals in the corral. But it was the smaller changes that made her heart swell. The kitchen garden bursting with vegetables, curtains at the windows, books filling the shelves Caleb had built for her. She found him in the near pasture, working with a young stallion, his movements patient and measured. He'd taught her that breaking horses was less about dominance and more about trust, much like healing a broken spirit. She'd thought more than once, "How are my two favorite people?" he called out, having spotted her approach. "Three," she corrected with a smile, placing his hand on her belly. "We're all fine." The joy that transformed his face made her laugh out loud, a sound that still sometimes surprised her with its freedom. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she protested, breathless and giddy. "A baby," he marveled. "Our baby. Due in winter," she confirmed. "I thought it fitting. New life in the cold season, just like us." That evening, they sat on the porch as had become their custom, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Eleanor had brought out her journal. She'd been writing their story. She'd told him, for their children and their children's children. "Read me some," Caleb requested, settling back in his chair. Eleanor opened to a recent entry and began. "Today marks 1 year since I found my voice in a courtroom in Cheyenne. But the truth is, I'd found it long before that, in the patient silences of a man who waited for my words without demanding them, in the laughter of children learning their letters, in the simple act of choosing to speak rather than being forced to remain silent." She paused, looking up at him. "Do you remember that first night, after the blizzard?" "Every moment," he assured her. "You spoke my name. 3 words," she said softly. "After 2 years of silence, I managed 3 words, and you acted like I'd given you the moon." You had," he said simply. They sat in companionable quiet for a while, the evening air filled with the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking about Theodore lately," she admitted, not with fear or anger anymore, just sadness for the life he chose, for the love he never knew. Harold wrote, just a brief note, saying he was courting a young woman in Chicago, trying to be better. I hope he succeeds. "You have a generous heart," Caleb observed. "I have a healed heart," she corrected. "There's a difference," as if summoned by talk of correspondence. The sound of horses approached. They looked up to see Sam Murphy riding in with a companion, a young woman who sat her horse uncertainly, clearly unaccustomed to riding. "Evening, folks," Sam called out. "Sorry to intrude, but this young lady just arrived on the stage. She's looking for the Rollins Ranch." The woman dismounted with Sam's help, and Eleanor could see she was barely more than a girl, perhaps 19 or 20, with dark hair and frightened eyes. She clutched a carpetbag in one hand and a crumpled piece of paper in the other. "I'm sorry," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm looking for Mrs. Eleanor Rollins. The lady at the general store said that you sometimes—" She stopped, tears threatening. Eleanor rose immediately, recognizing something in the girl's posture, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. "I'm Eleanor Rollins," she said gently. "Come inside. Sam, thank you for bringing her." Once inside, with tea poured and the girls seated at their table. The story came out in halting fragments. Her name was Ruth Morrison. She'd fled an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age, a business associate of her father's who'd already buried 2 wives. "They say I'm being foolish," Ruth whispered, staring into her tea. "That I should be grateful for such a match. But I heard someone told me about you, about how you'd started over, found your voice. I thought maybe—" She trailed off, looking lost. Eleanor reached across the table to take the girl's trembling hands. "You thought right," she said firmly. "You're brave to leave, brave to seek a different life, and you're welcome here as long as you need." "I can work," Ruth said quickly. "I can cook, clean, so—" "You can breathe," Eleanor interrupted gently. "First, you can breathe. The rest will come." Over the following days, Ruth slowly began to relax. She helped with the school, proving to have a gift with the younger children. She shared meals with them, gradually contributing to conversations. And one evening, as Eleanor played the piano Caleb had surprised her with for Christmas while he accompanied on his fiddle, Ruth began to sing, a clear, sweet voice that had been hidden behind fear. "You have a gift," Eleanor told her afterward. "Have you thought about teaching music?" Ruth's eyes widened. Who would? The same children who need to learn their letters need to learn beauty," Eleanor said firmly. "We'll add music lessons to the curriculum." And so the school grew, and with it, their family of choice. Ruth bloomed under their care, eventually catching the eye of Tom Anderson's eldest son, a courtship that proceeded with careful respect for her tentative trust. As Eleanor's pregnancy advanced, the community rallied around them. Women who had once whispered about the silent mail-order bride now brought baby clothes and advice. Men who had wondered at Caleb's choice now spoke of their respect for the family they'd built. The Barn School had become the heart of their small community, a place where children learned not just letters and numbers, but that their voices mattered, that their thoughts had value. Eleanor made sure of that, encouraging the shy ones to speak, teaching the bold ones to listen. One day in late autumn, as the first snow began to fall, Eleanor stood before her students, her belly now round and prominent, teaching them about the power of words. Words can hurt. She told them honestly. They can be used as weapons to tear down and destroy, but words can also heal. They can build bridges, offer comfort, speak truth. The important thing is that you choose your words. Don't let others choose them for you. Young James Murphy raised his hand. "Mrs. Rollins, is that why you didn't talk when you first came here?" Eleanor smiled at the boy's directness. "Yes, James. Someone had hurt me with words and actions, so I stopped using mine. But staying silent didn't protect me. It just made me smaller. Finding my voice again, choosing to speak, that's what made me free." That night, as snow continued to fall softly outside, Eleanor and Caleb lay together, her head on his chest, his hand protective over their unborn child. "I've been thinking about names," she said. "Grace, if it's a girl, for the grace that brought me here, that gave me you. And if it's a boy," she considered, "William, it means protector, like his father." Caleb pressed a kiss to her hair. "Either way, they'll grow up knowing their voice matters. That's your gift to them, to all the children you teach." "Our gift," she corrected. "None of this would exist without your patience, your faith in me when I had none in myself." They lay in comfortable silence, listening to the snow whisper against the windows. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice soft but clear in the darkness. "I love our life," she said simply. "I love our home, our school, our community. But mostly, I love that I can say those words freely, without fear, knowing they'll be received with joy. Always." Caleb murmured against her hair. "Every word, every day, always received with joy." As winter deepened around them, the Rollins Ranch stood as a beacon of hope in the Wyoming wilderness. a place where broken spirits learned to heal, where silence gave way to song, where love, patient enough to wait for words, was rewarded with a lifetime of freely given devotion. Eleanor continued to write in her journal, documenting not just their story, but the stories of all who found their way to her door, the women seeking courage, the children finding knowledge, the community discovering that strength often came in unexpected packages. The final entry of that year read, "I came to this place wrapped in silence, bound by fear, certain that words were too dangerous to speak. I found a man who showed me that silence could be a choice, not a prison, who waited for my words like the earth waits for rain, patiently, faithfully, knowing that when they came, they would bring life." And they did. Oh, how they did. The candle flickered as she closed the journal, one hand resting on her belly where new life stirred, the other reaching for Caleb in the darkness. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang its ancient song, and inside, two hearts, soon to be three, beat in perfect harmony, testament to the transformative power of patient love and the courage to speak one's truth. In the barn schoolhouse, slates waited for tomorrow's lessons. In the cabin, a cradle stood ready for winter's child. And in the silence that was no longer empty, but full of promise, Eleanor Rollins smiled, knowing that every word she'd been unable to speak had been waiting for this, for home, for love, for the freedom to choose her own voice and use it to light the way for others still searching for theirs. Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West. Where are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let's connect with fellow Western romance lovers around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Eleanor and Caleb's journey. Did their love story touch your heart? Let us know in the comments.